I turned 30 on a Tuesday. My mother handed me a small wooden box that morning and said, "Your father and I promised ourselves we'd give this to you the day you turned 30, not one day before." Inside was my own adoption paperwork. 29 years I'd spent believing a story that wasn't true, and 11 weeks left before I needed real answers for a genetic screening for my own daughter. I'm Josephine. Everyone calls me Jo. I'm 30. And this is the story of the box my parents kept sealed for 3 decades, and the 11 weeks I spent afterward trying to find a woman I hadn't known existed before that Tuesday morning. I grew up in a house that always felt completely uncomplicatedly whole. Sunday pancakes, a dad who coached my rec league soccer team badly, but enthusiastically a mom who kept every school photo in chronological order in a hallway that basically doubled as a timeline of my whole childhood. I would have told you without a second's hesitation that I understood exactly where I came from. I understood almost none of it. It turns out not the part that mattered most. I work as a genetic counselor at a regional hospital, which means my entire job is walking families through exactly the kind of information I'd apparently been missing about my own life the whole time. Hereditary risk factors, family medical history, the quiet genetic inheritance that shapes so much more than people realize. I sit across from expecting parents every week and ask them detailed questions about grandparents and great-aunts and conditions that ran in a family line. I'd answered those same questions about my own family 100 times over the years, confidently, completely, without a single doubt that any of it was true. My parents, Adeline and Dean, had always told me the story of my birth exactly the same way every single time it came up a slightly difficult labor, me arriving 3 days late, a name they'd picked out together in the hospital room. It was a small, warm, unremarkable story, the kind you don't think to question, because there's never been a single reason to. I did not open the box that morning, actually. My mother handed it to me, and I set it on my kitchen counter and made coffee instead, some instinct in me clearly not ready yet for whatever was inside, needing at least a few ordinary minutes of my regular Tuesday before anything changed. I told myself I'd get to it that weekend once things settled down. I let it sit there unopened for 4 full days. That's the thing nobody tells you about a lie this old. Even the box that finally breaks it open doesn't feel urgent at first. It just sits there quiet and ordinary, giving you every chance to keep not looking. I actually moved it once that first week from the kitchen counter to a closet shelf, telling myself it was just clutter I wanted out of the way. My husband asked about it in passing, and I gave him some vague answer about paperwork from my parents, which was technically true and completely beside the point. Looking back, I think some part of me needed it physically out of sight before I could let it stay out of mind for even a few more days. The complicating moment came the following Sunday at my parents' house for our usual family dinner 3 days before I finally opened the box. My mother, a little wistful over dessert, said out of nowhere, "You know, when you were small and asked why you didn't look much like either of us, I always told you that you were chosen, not an accident. That's better than anyone else gets to say." I remember smiling at the memory, thinking what a sweet, simple thing that had been to tell a kid. I had no idea yet how literally true that sentence actually was, or how much of the real story was still folded up inside a box sitting on my kitchen counter. The escalation started with a deadline, not a discovery. I need you to understand something before I keep going, because it matters for everything after this. I didn't open that box because I stopped trusting my parents, or went looking for a reason to blow up a relationship that had been steady and loving my entire life. I opened it because 5 days after my birthday, at my own 12-week prenatal appointment, my doctor asked the same family history questions I ask my own patients every week, and for the first time in my life, I genuinely didn't know if my answers were true. I remember sitting on the exam table in a paper gown, answering no history that I know of to question after question, the same reflexive answer I'd given 100 times before, except this time, something in my chest went tight, halfway through the specific tightness of realizing you're stating a fact you have no actual way of verifying. I have a genetic screening window that closes at 14 weeks, a specific test that becomes significantly less useful medically. The longer you wait past that point one, I explained to my own patients constantly without ever once imagining I'd need it myself. 11 weeks left, and an entire branch of my family's actual medical history sitting sealed in a box I still hadn't opened. I finally opened it that same night. Inside, my original birth certificate unamended, listing a woman named Marguerite Delacroix as my birth mother. A short letter in my mother's handwriting, dated the day of my adoption, that simply said, "We will love her exactly as much as if every part of this were biological, and we will tell her everything someday when she's old enough to hold it." And a manila folder of medical intake forms from the adoption agency Marguerite's own family history, hereditary conditions on her side I'd never once accounted for in any conversation I'd ever had about my own health. I read that letter probably a dozen times sitting cross-legged on my kitchen floor at nearly midnight, my husband already asleep down the hall. Somewhere in there I stopped being angry for a minute and just felt strange, disorienting grief for a woman I'd never met, and a version of my own childhood I'd never actually had running invisibly underneath the one I remembered. I need you to know something before I go further, because it recontextualizes everything I've told you up to here. I spent the first few days after opening that box doing the exact professional work I do for other families every week, building a family medical history from scratch, except this time the family was mine, and the woman at the center of it was a stranger I'd never met. I sat at my own desk during a lunch break, pulling up the same intake templates I hand my patients, filling in blanks with a stranger's name where my own mother's should have gone, feeling the strange double vision of doing my job and living inside the case file at the exact same time. I called my parents 2 days later, gently just to ask a few clarifying questions before I let myself feel anything bigger than curiosity. It took me most of that morning just to work up the nerve to actually dial, sitting with my phone in my hand at my kitchen table, the same table where I'd found the box only 2 days earlier. My mother's voice on the phone got quiet in a way I wasn't used to hearing from her. "I always meant to tell you sooner," she said. There was never a day that felt like the right one. 30 just became the number we promised ourselves years ago. And once we'd said it enough times, it started to feel like a real plan instead of just a way of putting it off. I didn't push further that call. I told myself I needed the medical information more urgently than I needed the emotional conversation, and that was true as far as it went. I spent that week doing what I do professionally, pulling public genealogy databases, cross-referencing the adoption agency's old intake records against a DNA relative matching service I use constantly for patients trying to locate biological family, for medical reasons, never once expecting to run that exact search on myself. I found Marguerite within 9 days. Alive, 58 years old, living 2 states away, working as a florist according to a small business page with her name on it. I sat with that information for 2 full days before I did anything with it, the same professional caution I'd use with any patient's case: verify everything twice before you let someone's whole understanding of their family change. I remember scrolling through her florist website late one night, looking at photos of bouquets she'd arranged, trying to find some resemblance in a handful of blurry photos of her working the counter, half expecting to feel something instant and profound, and mostly just feeling a strange, quiet curiosity instead, like meeting a distant relative you'd heard stories about, but never actually pictured clearly. I called the adoption agency's records office, the same kind of call I help patients make constantly, and requested whatever additional non-identifying medical history they had on file, my hands not quite as steady on the phone as they usually are during a workday call like this. What came back mattered more than I expected: a hereditary cardiac condition on Marguerite's side, one that would directly affect the specific screening panel my own daughter needed within the next few weeks. I sat at my desk after that call for a long time, doing the strange, dizzying work of understanding my own unborn daughter's medical risk through a woman I'd never spoken to in my life. I drove to my parents' house that weekend, the folder of records on the passenger seat, and sat in the driveway for almost 10 minutes before I went in. Not because I was scared exactly, but because I wanted to be completely sure of everything I needed to say before I let this conversation actually start. The porch light was already on. Even though it was still afternoon, the same warm little detail I'd walked toward my entire childhood, without ever once thinking to question what it actually meant that this was the only home I'd ever known. I've sat across from enough patients delivering hard genetic news to know you don't walk into a conversation like this without being ready for every direction it could go. My mother was in the kitchen when I came in, and she looked at the folder in my hands before she looked at my face, like some part of her had been expecting exactly this visit since the day she handed me the box. We sat down at the same kitchen table I'd done my homework at as a kid, and I laid out what I'd found plainly the way I would for any patient Marguerite's name, her current life, the cardiac condition, the screening deadline closing in a few short weeks. The house was quiet except for the refrigerator humming, and somewhere upstairs my father's footsteps moving carefully, like he already knew this conversation belonged to the two of us alone. I need to understand why 30 was the number I said, not just that it was the number. Why? My mother was quiet for a long moment, hands wrapped tightly around her coffee mug knuckles going pale against the ceramic. I couldn't have children, she said finally, not without a lot of loss first, more than I've ever told you the full truth of. By the time we adopted you, I'd spent years feeling like my body had already failed at the one thing everyone expected of me. She set the mug down carefully, hands still not quite steady, and continued eyes fixed on the table between us, rather than on my face. Telling people you were adopted felt for a long time like handing them one more reason to see me as less of a mother than I wanted so badly to be. I told myself waiting until you were an adult would mean you'd understand it as a fact about your history, instead of a verdict on whether I was really your mother. I think somewhere along the way, I was protecting myself more than I was protecting you, and I only fully understood that watching you carry that folder into my kitchen today. For 1 second, just one, I saw exactly why she'd done it. A woman who'd measured her own worth against a body that hadn't cooperated, choosing silence not out of malice, but out of a fear so old it had calcified into a promise she made to a version of herself decades before she ever made one to me back when she was young enough to believe silence could actually be a kindness, rather than just a very long delay. And then that second passed, and I was just sitting at my childhood kitchen table holding a folder of medical history that should have been mine to grow up with, looking at a mother who'd let her own old wound decide when I finally got to have it. I want to tell you it ended there clean and complete at that table. It didn't. What ended there was the version of my own origin story I'd carried around for 30 years without ever once questioning it. What came after took longer, and some of it surprised me more than the confrontation itself. It wasn't until almost 3 weeks later, once I'd finally worked up the nerve to call Marguerite directly, that I found the piece of this that actually hurt the most. I'd rehearsed what I'd say for days, and none of it mattered the moment she actually picked up. My careful opening lines just fell apart into something much simpler and messier than I'd planned. She picked up on the third ring, and once I explained who I was, there was a long silence before she said quietly, "I wrote you a letter when you turned 18. I sent it through the agency the way they told me I was allowed to. I never heard anything back, and I told myself that meant you didn't want to know me, and I respected that for 12 years. I sat down hard on my own kitchen floor. When she said that phone pressed so tight against my ear it actually hurt a little, back against the cabinet like my legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold me up. I called my mother that same night, voice shaking in a way it hadn't been during our first conversation. She was quiet for a long time before she admitted it. The letter had arrived, and she'd read it, and decided alone that 18 was too young, that I wasn't ready, that she'd give it to me eventually when the timing felt right. It had sat in a drawer for 12 years, the same kind of quiet, well-intentioned decision that had kept the whole box sealed in the first place. You read a letter meant for me and decided on your own that I wasn't allowed to have it yet, I said. That's not the same thing as protecting me, Mom. That's just making the same choice twice. She didn't argue that. I could hear her crying quietly on the other end, and for once I didn't rush to fill the silence with something gentler than what I actually felt. That detail landed harder than almost anything else in this entire story. It wasn't just about a birth 30 years ago anymore. It was about a woman who'd tried to reach me and been quietly turned away by someone deciding on my behalf what I could and couldn't handle knowing. Here's where I actually am with all of this now. I met Marguerite in person 3 weeks ago, careful and a little awkward in the way two strangers meeting for the first time always are made easier by the fact that we share the exact same laugh, apparently according to both of us noticing it within the first 10 minutes. She brought a small bouquet from her shop, wildflowers mostly, and handed it to me at the door like she wasn't quite sure what else you're supposed to bring to a moment like that. We sat in her kitchen for almost 4 hours comparing notes on a life we'd both been living in parallel without knowing it. She's coming to my daughter's birth if everything goes according to plan, which still feels strange and right at the same time to type out loud. My husband asked me recently how I actually feel about all of it, and the honest answer keeps changing depending on the day. Some days it feels like gaining something enormous. Other days it just feels like finally being handed the full picture of something I'd already been living inside the whole time. My relationship with my mother is different now, not broken, just recalibrated in a way that's still settling. We talk more openly than we used to mostly, though there are still days the conversation gets quiet in places it never used to. She came with me to one of Marguerite's flower deliveries a few weeks ago. Unprompted, said she wanted to understand this new shape our family was taking instead of just tolerating it from a distance. I don't think that was easy for her. I noticed anyway, and I told her so. I don't think she was ever a villain in this story. I think she was a scared, wounded person who made one understandable decision that quietly turned into 30 years of decisions she never fully revisited, each one a little easier to make than the one before it. I finished my genetic screening with 2 weeks to spare, in the end real family history behind every answer for the first time in my life. The technician running the test asked the same questions I ask my own patients constantly, and for once, every single answer I gave was one I'd actually verified myself, not just inherited unquestioned from a story I'd never had reason to doubt. My daughter will grow up knowing exactly where she comes from on both sides from day one. I've decided that much at least gets to be different this time. I've already started a version of my own box for her actually not sealed. Not waiting for some arbitrary birthday 30 years from now, just an ordinary folder in an ordinary drawer, updated as we go open for her to look through whenever she's curious enough to ask. I called Yusra, my closest friend, at the hospital the week everything with Marguerite finally settled into something calmer, and told her the whole thing start to finish over coffee in the break room. She listened the whole way through without interrupting once, which isn't like her. And when I finished, she just said, "You built an entire new family tree in 11 weeks. That's basically your actual job. You know that, right?" I laughed because she wasn't wrong, and because it was somehow easier to hear it framed that way than any other way I'd tried to explain it to myself. I still think about that first Tuesday sometimes, standing in my kitchen holding a box I hadn't opened yet. No idea how much of my own life was about to rearrange itself around what was inside it. I don't regret the 30 years I didn't know. I think I'd have regretted a lot more spending the rest of my life not knowing at all.